Welcome everyone to this second episode in the Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre Seminar Series 2017 to 2018 on the theme of God, Good and Evil in a Scientific Age. I'm really delighted to welcome our speaker for this evening, Professor Adrian Moore. Professor Moore is a Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Oxford. He's also Vice Principal of St Hugh's College, and he's the joint editor of the leading philosophy journal Mind. His major publications include the 1997 book Points of View, the 2003 discussion of Kant's moral and political philosophy, Noble in Reason, Infinite in Faculty, and the 2012 book The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, Making Sense of Things. Finally, Professor Moore is the presenter of a very popular BBC4 radio series on a history of the infinite, and you can listen to episodes of that radio series online. Today, he's going to talk to us about the new atheism, and I'd ask you to give him a very warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ralph, both for that introduction and for inviting me to speak at this seminar this afternoon. It's a great honour to be here. Now, Ralph began with various practical points, and I'm sorry to say that I'm going to begin with various practical points as well. The first of which I've only just realised there is a handout.
It's at the back if anyone doesn't have a copy.
Right, I in particular. Thanks. So I don't have a copy myself, so if I could have one, that would be helpful. Thanks.
I'm sure that happens too. Maybe one up here to begin with, Nikolai.
This is a copy.
Brilliant.
Perfect.
Lovely. Thank you very much. There are just a few quotations on the handout that I shall be referring to in due course, and it's helpful, obviously, if I've got a copy myself. The other practical thing is to pick up on something that Ralph himself said in his introductory comments, namely that although there is a question and answer session scheduled after my comments, I will be very happy for people to interrupt me in the course of what I'm saying if you want to. You may or may not want to, but if at any point I say something and somebody's itching to challenge it straight away, or if I say something that's unclear and somebody is itching for clarification, please do feel free to interrupt me before we get to what you might think of as the official Q&A section. Now, I can see just looking around the audience that there are a lot of people here in the room that have a good deal of philosophical and or theological expertise, and it's only fair for me to concede right from the outset that a lot of what I'm about to say is of a fairly elementary nature. So I hope it won't be too elementary, but I'll be making all sorts of comments and observations that are very familiar to a lot of people here. But of course, with a subject like philosophy or with a subject like theology, there's a sense in which there's no such thing as the shallow end and the deep end. And if you're trading in fairly elementary observations, you're still doing serious philosophy at one level. So I hope that it will be of interest. And for those people that have less in the way of a philosophical or theological background, I hope that this will help to make it that little bit more accessible. And my title, as you can see from the handout and as Ralph has already said, is The New Atheism. And I want to be raising some questions about what's come to be known as the new atheism, discussing some of the issues that arise from this and raising some concerns about it. And I think that I'm sure that most people in the room will be very familiar with what I have in mind when I refer to the new atheism. I'm talking about the kind of atheism that's associated with people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Anthony Grayling, Daniel Dennett, those sorts of people, who have recently advocated a kind of atheism that is distinctive in various ways. In particular, I guess it's fair to say that it's distinctive for being rather strident and rather evangelical. Among other things, what a lot of the new atheists believe is not just that theism is mistaken or misguided, but that there's something positively pernicious about it. And that's part of the reason, perhaps, for why it has this air of stridency and why there is a kind of evangelism that's associated with it. They're on a kind of crusade. But in many ways, it's not so much the atheism that I'm interested in as the new, because one of the questions that I want to raise, the first question that I want to raise, and this in a way will structure the whole discussion, is how does this so-called new atheism compare with older assaults on theism? Theism has come under attack in all sorts of ways over the centuries, and if this is a movement that is in some significant sense new, what is it that's new about it, and how does it compare, as I say, with older assaults on atheism? And in particular, I want to compare it to a school of thought that flourished in the early part of the last century, the early part of the 20th century, with which in many ways it brooks comparison and with which it might even sometimes be confused, although I'm going to suggest that there are very significant differences between them. And what I have in mind is logical positivism, the movement in philosophy that was known as logical positivism, associated particularly with the Vienna School, although people in this country were first introduced to it through the work of Jair. And it's Jair's version of logical positivism that I'll be particularly focusing on. In some ways, what Jair offered us and what he introduced to the English philosophers was a caricature of what was actually a much more sophisticated movement, a much more sophisticated position. But nevertheless, for current purposes, even if it is a caricature, it'll suffice because it presents us with the materials that are necessary for my purposes, comparing that older movement with the new atheism. And the most significant and most striking difference between what we find if we look back at logical positivism and what we find if we look at this newer movement is that the logical positivists, although they were mounting a very scathing attack of their own on theism, were very insistent that they were not atheists. The new atheism is a kind of atheism. Logical positivists took issue with theism, but said they were not combating it with atheism. So what was going on? Well, what was going on was that they wanted to get us to think of the most basic tenets of theism, and in particular the belief in God itself, not as false, but as nonsensical. So their view was that when people claimed that they believed in God, or on the contrary, when people claimed that they didn't believe in God, if people subscribed either to theism or to atheism, actually what they were doing was they were trading in a kind of gibberish. That was the view, that was the logical positivist view. That these pronouncements about God, and in particular pronouncements about whether God exists or not, were strictly speaking nonsensical. And the reason that they thought they could take this bold stance was that they had a very particular theory of what counted as meaning, or in their terms, what counted as strict and literal meaning. And in particular, for any assertion, any proposition to be meaningful, there had to be some way of testing it against experience. You had to be able to tell by appeal to experience whether it was true or false. And if you couldn't do that, if there was no way of comparing it with experience to test whether it was true or false, then there was no genuine claim being made. The apparent pronouncement, the apparent assertion was only apparent. There wasn't a genuine pronouncement or genuine assertion being made. And in particular, this was the view that they took about the assertion that God exists. And the kind of thing that they compared it with was the kind of thing that they found in philosophers such as Hegel, where you found sentences which, on the face of it, looked as if they were grammatically well formed and contained words that were familiar from the lexicon, and yet they were run together in such a way that, according to the positivists, it just wasn't clear what on earth was intended. So, something like the absolute sublates itself by virtue of being its own negation, or, something along those lines. I mean, I don't know whether that's a direct quotation from Hegel or not, but it could easily be. And by the way, I'm being facetious at the moment. I don't mean to be casting aspersions on Hegel. I mean, I think that Hegel is a great philosopher, an extremely important and extremely significant philosopher. But the fact remains that that jumble of words that I just came out with is the kind of jumble of words that you might find in one of Hegel's texts. And the logical positivists looked at sentences like that, or sentences in inverted commas, and said, look, there's just no meaning attaching to this string of words. There's a sense in which it's syntactically well formed, there's a sense in which it's English or German or whatever the language might be, but there's also a sense in which it's meaningless. We just do not know how we would go about verifying that or falsifying that by appeal to experience. Strictly speaking, nothing has been said. Strictly speaking, there's no meaning attaching to this sentence. And if somebody asks us to agree with them or disagree with them when they say that the absolute sublates itself by virtue of being its own negation, then the reply has to be, I'm sorry, I don't know what it is that you're asking me to agree with or to disagree with. And then their view was that actually the same is true even for such a basic assertion as God exists. We just don't know what it means, they said. There is no strict literal meaning attaching to that sentence. And so somebody like Jair was very adamant that although obviously he was mounting an assault on theism, nevertheless he was very adamant that the way in which he was doing that was not by being an atheist. He wasn't saying, look, I think these claims about God's existence are false. He was saying, I'm neither a theist nor an atheist. I think these claims about God's existence are meaningless. So that was the logical positivist assault on theism. And on the face of it, you might think, your first reaction might be, well, if we compared that with the new atheism, the kind of thing that you find in Dawkins and Dennett and these guys, if you compare the two, then it looks on the face of it as if two things. Number one, that the logical positivists in a way were operating with a blunter instrument than the new atheists. I mean, this is, it's a blunt instrument in as much as they're telling the theist, you're not even getting as far as saying something that's false. You know, you've come out with sheer gibberish. So on the one hand, it looks like a blunter instrument, and on the other hand, well, I shouldn't say on the other hand, because actually this is, in a way, the same point again. It looks as if they're operating with a blunter instrument, and it looks as if it's effective, it's a more damaging instrument of assault. I mean, at least the new atheists are prepared to allow the theist the dignity of having got as far as saying something, whereas the logical positivists were saying, no, you haven't even managed to do that. You haven't even got as far as saying something that can be dignified with the label false or true. But in fact, what I want to suggest, what I want to argue is that it's very much the other way round. That in its own way, the logical positivist assault on theism was a much sharper instrument, a much more delicate instrument, whatever the relevant metaphor is. And also, in many ways, was less of an assault on theism, or at least can be seen as less of an assault on theism. I mean, this is going to raise some very large questions about what it takes to be a theist. And these are questions that we can come back to in the question and answer session. But what I want to try to urge is that there is a way of understanding theism whereby it's coming under a much cruder attack from this more recent position than it was doing from the older logical positivist position. So let me try, if I can, to give you some indication of what I have in mind. So, yes, the logical positivists were telling us that theistic claims were meaningless. And yes, the kind of example that they often appealed to was the kind of example that I myself have already appealed to. The sort of thing that you might find in Hegel. But the fact is that a sentence of that kind, that toy sentence, that sample sentence that I introduced earlier about the absolute, was just one example of the kind of sentence that they would have said was meaningless by their criteria. And there were all sorts of other examples that they had in mind when they said that not all sentences, not all declarative sentences are, strictly speaking, meaningful. So another example of a very different kind would be a sentence like, all bananas turn purple when nobody is looking at them. Okay, so somebody who subscribed to that or purported to subscribe to that might be of the view that as long as you're looking at a banana, then it will be yellow. But the minute you turn your back on it, and provided that nobody else is looking at it either, then it turns purple. And somebody might come along and for some bizarre reason propose this as a theory about bananas. And of course, most of us would not even begin to take such a thesis about bananas seriously. I mean, we would think that this person was completely off their head if they were seriously proposing it. But again, it's interesting to note what the logical positivist reaction to such a sentence would be. I mean, they too might use the label crazy, but their complaint would be not that there's no good reason to think that this is true. Their complaint would be, this is meaningless. There is no sense attaching to this claim about bananas, or this purported claim about bananas, because in the very nature of the case, there's no way of testing it by appeal to experience, they would say. You can't tell from looking at bananas whether or not it's true that they turn purple the moment nobody is looking at them. And so they would have said, this is an example of something that's meaningless. So I'm mentioning that example just by way of emphasizing that not all their examples of purported meaninglessness were of the Hegelian type, the sentence about the absolute. But even more significantly and much more relevantly for these purposes, we have to remember that the logical positivists were prepared to say that all evaluative sentences, all ethical sentences, ethical utterances, were, strictly speaking, meaningless. So, for example, if somebody came along and said, it's always unjustifiable to inflict gratuitous suffering onto another human being, supposing somebody made such a pronouncement, or supposing somebody said it's never justified to kill another human being. Well, the logical positivists had their own story about what was going on in such a case, and it was an interesting story. But their view was that such a pronouncement was, strictly speaking, meaningless. There was no literal meaning attaching to such a sentence because, they said, there was no such thing as testing it by appeal to experience. So their own different story about what was going on in such a case was that you were expressing some attitude of yours towards the world, or some emotion of yours, or whatever. I mean, let's not worry too much about the details here. But at any rate, you weren't saying something that was strictly speaking, meaningful. And strictly speaking is the operative phrase here, I think, because we're reminded that their criterion of meaning was a very strict criterion. They had this rather narrow conception of what they meant by meaning. And so, you know, it fell out that a lot of things that we wouldn't naturally dismiss as meaningless did come out as meaningless by their criteria. And so that straightway leaves open the possibility that theological pronouncements, and in particular the bare assertion that God exists, might enjoy a kind of meaning of a less strict kind, even on the logical positivists' own understanding. And this is the way in which they often talked, and it's the way in which you find Jair himself often talking. When Jair was presenting the basic logical positivist view, he often did it in terms of this distinction between what he called strict and literal meaning, and various looser kinds of meaning that attached to utterances of other kinds, including the example that we've just been looking at, the sort of meaning that attaches to evaluative or moral utterances. Now, it was only propositions that enjoyed what he would have called strict and literal meaning that got as far as being true or false. To be true or false was to have that narrow kind of meaning. They were insistent on that. To be true or false, a proposition had to be such that there was a way of telling whether it was true or false by appeal to experience. So allowing these other propositions a different, looser kind of meaning of their own wasn't to allow that they too could enjoy a kind of truth or falsity. That was not what the logical positivists wanted to say. So if theological pronouncements, as it were, came under this other umbrella of enjoying a different sort of meaning, still the view was that you were saying something that wasn't strictly true or false. Nevertheless, you might have been making a very interesting and very significant linguistic move of another kind. And it is an interesting thesis that perhaps that's the kind of view that we should take of theological pronouncements. So now I want to appeal to the first quotation on the handout, and this is a quotation by Jair, and it sort of summarises in its own way the point that I've just been trying to make, the point that I've just been trying to emphasise. So let me read the quotation out in full. This is from Language, Truth and Logic. And the quotation goes as follows. According to the account that we have given of religious assertions, there is no logical ground for antagonism between religion and natural science. As far as the question of truth or falsehood is concerned, there's no opposition between the natural scientist and the theist who believes in a transcendent God. For since the religious utterances of the theist are not genuine propositions at all, and in this context what Jair meant by that was since they lack literal meaning, this narrow kind of meaning that he and the other logical positivists were interested in, since they're not genuine propositions at all, they cannot stand in any logical relation to the propositions of science. I'm going to break off at that point. We'll get to the second paragraph in due course, but you can see what's going on there. This is Jair emphasising that a theist, the sort of person that's prepared to subscribe to the claim that God exists, is not, on Jair's view, making a claim that's true or false, and therefore, in particular, is not making a claim that can stand in any kind of logical relation to the sorts of claims that scientists make, which are straightforwardly true or false. And so there's no room for logical relations between the two. In particular, there's no room for logical conflict between the two. We can't think of the theist as saying something that the scientist might challenge because they're playing different games, if you want to put it in those terms. There's a completely different kind of linguistic move going on in the two cases. So, as he says, there's no opposition between the natural scientist and the theist who believes in a transcendent God, because the religious utterances of the theist are not genuine propositions at all. That's the first paragraph in this quotation. But then paragraph 2, and this is the really interesting one in this context, Jair goes on to say, an interesting feature of this conclusion is that it accords with what many theists are accustomed to say themselves. Now, we can debate that, of course. I mean, it's up for grabs to what extent theists would be comfortable with seeing things in these terms. But my own view, for what it's worth, is that there's a good deal of truth in that second paragraph, that quotation from Jair, that in fact the kinds of things that he's saying here, you would find a lot of theists who were prepared to say exactly the same, who were prepared to endorse the claims that Jair is making here. That's to say, they would be prepared to acknowledge that their theism was not in any direct competition with science because it was of a completely different kind. Whether they would go as far as to admit that they were saying something that was neither true nor false when they assert God's existence is a further question, obviously. But it's a question, as much as anything else, it's a question about the nature of truth and falsity. I mean, it's a massive philosophical question in its own right. We can come back to that in the discussion, but it may not cut as much ice as it seems to, is what I'm suggesting. And in particular, there is room for the view that what I have been describing as the logical positivist assault on atheism may not really be all that much of an assault at all. That at one level, we may be able to hear the logical positivists as saying a whole lot of things about religious discourse that many people that go in for religious discourse would themselves be prepared to say. That's the suggestion. Whereas the new atheists, I take it, are coming along and saying a whole lot of things that any theist would take exception to. So in particular, still continuing to focus on the same issue, Dawkins especially, I think the same is true of a lot of other people who would be classified as new atheists as well, but Dawkins in particular is absolutely adamant that the claim that God exists is something like a scientific claim. In direct opposition to what the logical positivists were arguing, Dawkins' view is that if somebody says that God exists, they're making a claim about the way that the universe is, which is on a par with the claim that E equals mc squared, or on a par with some hypothesis about evolution or whatever. It's a scientific claim. It has to be treated in the same way that other scientific claims have to be treated, and the view is that it's a scientific claim that lacks the evidence that other scientific claims have, and that therefore the right view to take about it is that it's false. That's Dawkins' position. And again, I want to appeal to the handout. I've actually got 3 quotations here from Richard Dawkins. I'll read all 3 of them out, but between them they make this point very graphically. They serve as a stark indication of the kind of view that Richard Dawkins wants to take about religious discourse. So let's go through them one by one. First of all, here we find Richard Dawkins saying, you can't escape the scientific implications of religion. You can't escape the scientific implications of religion. So that's directly opposed to what we saw Jair saying in the previous quotation. A universe with a God would look quite different from a universe without one. A physics, a biology where there is a God is bound to look different. So the most basic claims of religion are scientific. Religion is a scientific theory. That's a direct quotation from Dawkins. And then again, quotation number 2 on the handout. Either God exists or he doesn't. It's a scientific question. One day we may know the answer, and meanwhile we can say some pretty strong, I think I've missed a word out, some pretty strong things about the probability. One day we may know the answer, meanwhile we can say some pretty strong things about the probability. That's quotation number 2. And then the third quotation, which in many ways I think is the most striking of all, and the more you think about this third quotation, the more interesting and the more striking it becomes, actually, in my view. Again, a direct quotation from Richard Dawkins. God's existence or non-existence is a scientific fact about the universe. There's that same point again. Discoverable in principle, even if not in practice. If he existed and chose to reveal it, God himself could clinch the argument noisily and unequivocally in his favour. If God existed and chose to reveal it, God himself could clinch the argument noisily and unequivocally in his favour. Now, there's all sorts of things that you might query in that sentence. Apart from anything else, there's the fact that it's not gender neutral. I've been striving myself not to use pronouns at all, personal pronouns at all, when talking about God, but you can't resist it when you're quoting other people. But be that as it may, I just don't know what Dawkins has in mind here. I just don't know what he has in mind. What would it be? What sequence of events is he envisaging that would constitute a noisy, unequivocal demonstration of God's existence? And the more you think about it, I mean, I simply don't know. It'd be interesting to have this conversation with him. I mean, I take it that what's at stake is not some old guy with a long white beard stepping down from the clouds and proclaiming to be God. But if that's not what he's envisaging, then what is he envisaging? And my own view, for what it's worth, is that the sheer fact that he's envisaging anything at all, if he is, makes me think, well, no wonder he's an atheist. I mean, no wonder he's an atheist. I mean, if it was the kind of thing that could be settled noisily and unequivocally in some very direct way to the satisfaction of Richard Dawkins, then no wonder he thinks that the universe is not like that. It's small wonder that he wants to say, look, there's no good evidence to believe in anything of that kind. It all begins to make sense. But my own attitude, and perhaps the attitude of other people in the room, perhaps not, this might emerge in the Q&A session, is that to look at it in that way is to be reminded of how crude a misrepresentation of theism this is. And in particular, it seems to me that we don't do well to think of theism as a scientific hypothesis. I mean, that just isn't what it is, on my view. So as far as this particular debate is concerned, and in particular as far as the differences between logical positivism and the new atheism are concerned, I find myself much more sympathetic to the kind of view that was being propounded by the logical positivists. I mean, I'm far from subscribing to logical positivism myself, far from subscribing to it. There are all sorts of other different complaints that I have about positivism. But nevertheless, there's a kernel of truth there, it seems to me, that is completely missing from the new atheism. And that we do well to think of theism as something of a completely different kind from a scientific hypothesis. Now, as I've already said, it's a further question whether you want to go as far as to say, and in particular, the question whether whether to be a theist or not is not a question of truth or falsity. I mean, whether we want to go all the way with the logical positivists and say this is just not a matter of truth or falsity at all. I mean, that is a further issue. But as I've already indicated, it's not as significant an issue, in my view, as it may appear to be. So there are some big questions there about the nature of truth and falsity and about how much ice it cuts to say that an assertion is true or false. And in particular, what... well, no, let me just stop at that point. There's an issue about how much ice it cuts. We might come back to that in the question and answer session. You want me to keep going till about 6?
That would be fine, absolutely.
Okay, fine. So I've already said far less than I was intending to. I was envisaging covering much more territory than I have, so that's always the way, isn't it? There's 10 minutes left, and there's quite a lot to cram into the 10 minutes. But let me just say... 15. No, that's fine. 5 minutes will make all the difference, I'm sure. We'll see. Well, let me make some observations that are almost at the level of autobiography rather than philosophy or theology. I mean, this is just a kind of credo. This is what I think, for what interest that's worth. But I'll say these things anyway, and again, you know, it may be that we can pick up on them in the question and answer session. But my own view is that if you do think of theism as or if you think of the claim that God exists as a claim that can be said to be true or false, if you do, and if you're not thinking of it as a scientific hypothesis in the way that Dawkins is, but rather as something more like a metaphysical hypothesis, if we can use the word metaphysical in this context. If you want to say, look, the logical positivists were wrong, this is a claim that does deserve the accolade of being either true or false, if we think that, but it's not to be settled by ordinary scientific means. If we think all of that, then my own view is that the problem of suffering, which is one of the classic problems in the philosophy of religion and in theology that confronts theism, the problem of suffering, the problem of how to reconcile the existence of suffering with a metaphysical hypothesis of that kind, is a decisive argument against any such metaphysical hypothesis. So if we think that what's at stake here is that there is a supremely benevolent, supremely powerful being who would eliminate suffering if that were possible, and who could eliminate suffering, so it is possible, then there ought not to be any suffering. That's my view. Now that's a massive, massive, massive issue, and there's probably already been people in this very series that have addressed this very question. So, all I'm doing at this point is just, as I said earlier, making something like an autobiographical observation about how I see things. I mean, I haven't offered anything by way of an argument for that view, and obviously there's a huge amount that has been said about this and that has been written about this, and there's a lot that can be said in opposition to the view that I've just committed myself to. But there it is, for what it's worth. That's my own take on theism, construed as something like a metaphysical hypothesis. But it's not obvious to me that that's the best way or the right way to construe theism. So it's not obvious to me that the best way to think of theists is as people who are wedded to a particular metaphysical hypothesis, any more than it's obvious to me that the right way to think of theists is as people who are committed to a particular scientific hypothesis. And in particular, if you think about the relationship between theism and suffering, which is the thing that I just briefly fastened on, even if what I just said was true, and there are going to be plenty of people in the room who disagree with me strongly about that, I'm well aware that what I've just said will arouse a lot of opposition. But even if what I said is true, I would be the first to acknowledge that it's often in moments of suffering, sometimes moments of very intense suffering, that people have their most acute sense of God, or that theism plays its most significant role in people's lives, or however you want to put it. And that, I mean, that's just a fact, I think. That's just an anthropological fact about the way in which a belief in God has often in the past interacted with the suffering that people have experienced, and how it's in some ways helped them or consoled them or given them strength or whatever. And that seems to me to be, in its own way, entirely appropriate. But that's because I don't think that theism is a commitment to a metaphysical hypothesis. Something of a completely different kind, in my view. And again, it's noteworthy if we think in particular about Richard Dawkins and some of the things that he says. There is a section in one of his writings where he addresses this very issue and talks about the whole idea that people find a kind of comfort or a kind of consolation in theism in the face of suffering. And he acknowledges that there's some truth to that. He thinks it's, as I put it earlier, a simple anthropological fact that people do find that sort of comfort and that sort of solace in their theism. But then he goes on to make the point, the sheer fact that it's consoling doesn't give us any reason to think that it's true. Just the sort of point that you might expect Richard Dawkins to make. So he says, yes, it's true that when people confront suffering of various kinds, they do very often find some comfort in their belief in God. But even so, that doesn't give us any reason whatsoever to think that their belief in God is a true belief, says Dawkins. Just what you would expect him to say, just the kind of thing that he should say on his own terms. I suppose what I'm doing as far as that is concerned is I'm agreeing with Richard Dawkins. So at this point, we would be in tune with each other, because I also would want to say the sheer fact that somebody finds solace in something doesn't make it true. The sheer fact that somebody finds solace in subscribing to a certain belief doesn't make it true. But that's because I'm not wedded to the view that we need to be talking about truth and falsity at all in this kind of context. So in its own way, this talk that I've just given has been a kind of a defense of theism against the new atheism, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if there were people in the room who were sitting there thinking, well, with friends like that, who needs enemies? There may well be people who think, well, no, this is crazy. What kind of a defense of theism is this? To be standing here claiming to be defending theism against the new atheism, but admitting that we might be talking about something that's not true. That is, I don't know what's the right phrase here. So, it's a backhanded compliment, let's put it that way. For sure, this may be much too close to atheism for comfort for a lot of people in the room, and certainly it may be much too close to the logical positivist view for comfort for a lot of people in the room. But there it is. And perhaps I will stop at that point. I mean, there's plenty more that I could say, but that's probably a natural point at which to break.
So thank you very much, Adrian, for that really interesting talk. We have about 20 minutes available for questions and answers, and I'd like to remind the audience to await the microphone before they deliver their question, which Mikołaj will take to them. I think we had a few around this region of the room. Well, if we go back from the front, so start.
No problem. Alex Norman. Thank you very much, Professor Moore, for the wonderful talk. I just thought you might be amused to hear, if you don't know of it already, of the there's an early Buddhist scripture, an early sutra, in the Theravada tradition, which I feel that Dawkins ought to read, where the claim is made that when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he wanted to show off his glory, so he marched up into the heavens. And stood there and displayed himself, and out of his left eye streamed water, and out of his left nostril streamed water, and out of the pores of his skin on the left side water streamed, and out of the right-hand side fire. But anyway, I just wonder whether that would do for Dawkins. I was just thinking of unequivocal demonstrations. I just thought I'd mention that.
I mean, you know, you're reminding us it is a very, very interesting question. What would do for Dawkins? But maybe, except that wouldn't be particularly noisy, would it?
Thank you very much indeed. Very stimulating, and I'm in a lot of agreement with what you've said, but I want to press just on one or 2 points. The claim that God exists being neither true nor false, I wonder whether there's a sense in which the location of the statement that God exists in our discourse might be similar to the place that the statement that the world exists occupies in our discourse, and that some of the reason why we find it puzzling to say that God does or doesn't exist is similar to the reason why we find it puzzling to say that the world does or does not exist. And there's a similar degree of lack of specificity in what we mean by God and what we mean by world, because in lots of senses one could say it's true or false, or neither true nor false. So I'm in agreement with that. I would like to say, I think that in some ways the statement that God exists is a kind of confessional statement. But even then, having said that, one hasn't said very much about where it does fit in one's discourse. So to get at that point, I wonder whether I could challenge you on the use of the term theist.
Yes.
But because, I mean, are there any practicing theists in this room? I mean, I'm a Christian, you see, and so when I stand in church on a Sunday, I recite the creed. I'm certainly not reciting any kind of metaphysical hypothesis, and I'm not making a metaphysical hypothesis. I'm confessing faith that God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, etc., etc., etc. And then I get to a point where I say that, and on the third day, crucified on Pontius Pilate, and on the third day. So ingredient within, internal to the discourse of a Christian is a falsifiable claim. So I haven't really given you a clear question, and that's partly because I haven't got a clear answer that I want to push you towards accepting. But I would be very intrigued to see whether you think there's any mileage in pursuing those kinds of lines of thought.
Good. Well, there's a huge amount in what you've just said. A lot there for me to pick up on. First of all, my use of the word theism, which I suppose in this context was simply meant as something that contrasts with atheism. I'm well aware that the term has specialist uses, which I wasn't particularly concerned to capture. I mean, I was using the word in a very loose way. But it's absolutely appropriate for you to raise the question that you have done and to press me on that, because what exactly do I mean by theism? And in particular, what do I mean if part of my view is that the theist isn't involved in subscribing to something that's either true or false? So it seems to follow from that I'd better do something other than define the theist as somebody who believes that God exists. Because if you put it in that way, then whether you like it or not, it just does look like a commitment to a certain proposition, a certain metaphysical proposition. So there are two interesting questions that I suppose arise at this point, or that arise in particular for somebody in my position. One of those questions is, could we get some sort of mileage out of continuing to think of theism as the belief that God exists, but counting that as having a misleading surface grammar or something along those lines, reconstruing just what shape that cashing out of theism has, on the one hand, or on the other hand, would there be mileage to be got out of the view that what it was not belief that God exists, but something like belief in God? Is there an interesting distinction between those two? And if there is, what is the distinction, and how's it cashed out, and what is involved in belief in God? If it's not a commitment to some metaphysical proposition. So those are obviously, again, huge questions in theology, philosophy of religion, and there's not much helpful that I have to say about them here and now, other than to flag them. But then, there are a lot of other really interesting points in what you just said, but one other really interesting point was, well, look, if the question is not just in general terms the question of theism, but in more specific terms the question of Christianity, isn't the Christian committed to some claims that are straightforwardly true or false? And in particular, isn't there a problem for the theist if there's reason to suppose, for the Christian if there's reason to suppose that they're false? And then in particular, you fastened on the resurrection. Obviously, that's the prime example, if not the only example. Again, I'm not going to be able to say anything very helpful or interesting in response to that, other than just to acknowledge that it's a really interesting question. And I suppose the issue is whether there might even be mileage in the view that we could even take the same sort of approach to the resurrection that we take to God's existence.
I don't think it's a matter of fact.
Right.
Jesus rose, we have to change our fact discourse.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very helpful. I think we have to change our fact discourse in relationship to Jesus and our truth discourse as well.
Yeah, and if those are two different things, by the way, it's very, very helpful for you to introduce the idea of a fact here, which is an idea that I don't think I have mentioned at all in any of my comments. But of course, it's very, very pertinent to what I've been talking about. And if what we want to do is put a huge amount of weight in this debate on the notion of a fact, and want to distinguish the question of whether a claim is factual from the question of whether it's true or false, if we want to draw that kind of distinction, then in a way that's music to my ears. In a way I'd be very amenable to that, and it wouldn't worry me if the net effect of that was that we then went back over some of the claims that I've been making and said, well, okay, you can take that sort of position, you can adopt that sort of position, but really what you're doing is you're saying that theism is not a matter of fact. You're not saying that it's not a matter of truth and falsity. We can bring the language of truth and falsity back in. If we're drawing that distinction, then perhaps what happens is that the language of truth and falsity has a certain kind of fluidity and flexibility over and above the language of facthood that makes it appropriate again. And that's fine, really, in a way, as far as I'm concerned, because part of what I was interested in doing was, as I mentioned in passing at one point, was trying to play down how big a deal it is whether we use the language of truth or falsity or not. People think it's a huge deal. People think that it couldn't get much more fundamental than that. Whether these claims count as true or false or not, never mind whether they count as true or false, right? You know, that's the next issue to be addressed. But whether they're even candidates for truth or falsity in the first place, people think, you know, that's as fundamental as it gets. You know, how on earth could anything be less significant in this whole area? But it just doesn't seem that way to me. I don't think that the question of whether we're dealing with truths or falsehoods here cuts that deep.
I wanted to throw in the Dostoevsky quotation. He says in a letter written in prison at some point, I believe, if you could prove to me that that the truth is not with Christ, I would rather stay with Christ than with the truth. It's not necessarily a position I want to condone, but I just wanted to say that it's out there. I know there's more questions this side, and there are some this side, and we're not able to give them that much time. So I wanted to ask if people can try to make their questions short illocutionary statements, and if we can have relatively short answers, we'll get through as many as we can. Perhaps if we go from the front on this side, but we'll make sure we get. I know you have.
Actually, it might help if what people did was not ask questions, but just make assertions, because then I would shut up.
That's also permitted. Can I just ask a question? Yes.
I'm afraid we're going to start with Nick Waghorn, and then we'll see how far we can get.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I had lots of different questions. I'll keep it to a short one. So maybe I'm kind of being a very unsophisticated thinker in the way that you and Andrew are not. I'm not a sufficiently Moorean thinker. But what I would probably say, you say, well, the kind of this issue of fact and doesn't cut that deep. What would worry me, I mean, comparing this to maybe what you might say about morals, is just I wouldn't see any point to theism if it was not metaphysically true or scientifically true, if it was just a case of kind of our attitudes to the world. If that was true of morality, I wouldn't really see the point of morality. And I guess if that was true of theism, I just wouldn't see the point of it.
Right, I'm sure you're not being a lot less sophisticated than Andrew and me, and in particular, I'm sure that you've just raised a very significant concern about this sort of approach to these issues. Ralph has urged us to keep this brief, so let me just say something really brief, which is not going to satisfy you at all, but I'll say it anyway.
Actually, I urge it to be really brief but satisfactory.
Right. Okay. Well, these.
Easily satisfied.
Yes. Yes. I think yes. These are conflicting desiderata, I think. But what I would take exception to in your question was if it's just a matter of our attitude to the world, either in the theistic case or in the moral case, how can it be that significant, or something along those lines? I mean, that wasn't exactly how you put it, but something along those lines. And I think what I would do is I would just take issue with the word just. You say it's just a matter of our attitude. Well, I'm not sure what the word just is doing there. Our attitudes can be very, very, very significant, I think. So that's not a satisfactory answer, but that's the kind of answer that I would want to give.
The young lady in the red top, yeah?
I really appreciated your diagnosis of logical positivism and the new atheism, but I'm worried that for your own view, you have two misconceptions about theism that are weakening your discussion of it. So the first is that I do think that many theists, at least Christians, see their theism as a matter of truth, and the very reason they hold to this metaphysical picture from which springs a moral set of principles is that they think it is a factual, true description of the world. And then the second one is on the problem of suffering. You said it's not like scientific facts, and so there's a disanalogy from what Dawkins was saying in that respect, but Actually, I think that it is dysnags in the sense that the problem of suffering cannot be a decisive argument for or against the existence of a good God. Because just as in science, the reason that science doesn't suffice to answer the religious question is looking at the physical world doesn't tell you who made it, what it's made for, why it was designed this way, and so on. Looking at suffering doesn't tell you if God can redeem it, which is the view in Christianity, if he had to allow it, in a sense, to remain both just and loving, and so on. So I think it'd be good to go up one level to the metaphysical there. And if you haven't read it, I would suggest Why Suffering by Ravi Zacharias and Vince Vitale, who was an Oxford professor of theology and philosophy on this issue.
Good, thanks. Just in response to your first point, I'm just simply going to agree with you about that. Because your first point, I take it, was a point about how most theists view their own theism. And it would be crazy for me to present a view of the kind that I just have done and to want to insist that this was faithful to people's self-conception. So I agree that would be crazy. And it is a real question. I mean, I purport to be defending a kind of atheism. A kind of theism. There's a very Freudian slip of the tongue there. But it is a real question how comfortable most theists would be with support of that kind. And I agree that a lot of people, perhaps even most people who describe themselves as theists, would say something like, with friends like that, who needs enemies? This is not how we understand theism. So I think that's right. I just agree with you about that. The second point about the problem of suffering, what you're quite rightly doing is just reminding us of what a huge issue that is. I mean, I simply stated that, as I understood it, if you think of the claim that God exists as a metaphysical hypothesis of a certain sort, then suffering is a decisive argument against it. But number one, it's very, very important to be very clear about a metaphysical hypothesis of what sort. I mean, you'd have to make crystal clear what exactly it was that you understood by the word God in that context. And secondly, even once you've done that, there's a huge amount more to be said, and you've gestured at some of what more there is to be said, and I just acknowledge that. I mean, I haven't even begun to mount any kind of defence of my view in what I've just said. I just registered what my view was, but there's all sorts of powerful arguments on the other side. I agree.
And we're going to conclude with a brief question from the gentleman at the back, and I'm very sorry if I've been unfair to anyone missing out there.
Thank you very much indeed. Nadeem Al-Hassani, Hertford College. I just have a question. I thought your presentation was very lucid, exceptionally lucid, especially in relation to the earlier period dominated by the logical positivists, with figures such as A.J. Ayer. I also appreciate the distinctions that you're making in the sense that the positivists did not regard theistic statements as being necessarily true or false, and they were therefore statements of a lesser kind about the world, whereas the new atheists, like Dawkins, seem to be suggesting that these are scientific claims that are being made, I think. And it's interesting that Dawkins does indeed, in your third quote, regard both the existence and the non-existence as a scientific fact, nevertheless, about our universe. And I wasn't quite sure whether you agreed even though you disagree with Dawkins in relation to those theistic claims being scientific, whether you thought they were still nevertheless metaphysical claims, even if one is not wedded to a metaphysical perspective oneself, whether the claims either for or against the existence of God are nevertheless themselves metaphysical and also logical to some extent. And I'm thinking of Michael Dummett, who was recently passed away, of course, Professor Emeritus of the university, who argued that the God question was unresolvable for that reason, because we haven't yet defined clearly enough what kind of claims theistic claims are. They're not scientific claims, but is it not the case that they are nevertheless metaphysical claims or logical claims about the universe?
Good. Incidentally, I think you're wrong about Michael Dummett.
Yes.
There is a striking passage in one of his latest publications. I can't remember which book it is, actually. I think it's the book that he wrote called Thought and Reality. But there's a striking quotation in one of the footnotes, I think. It's either in a footnote or in passing, where he says something like, the claim that God exists can be settled one way or the other. He does regard it as something that's straightforwardly true or false, and he does think that in principle we can know which of the two it is. But what's really striking is that he then goes on to say something like, I wish I could remember the exact quotation, but he says something like, I expect it to be settled within the next 2 or 3 generations. Does anybody else remember this quotation? Really, really striking, as if we're on the brink of it, like some mathematical theorem that people have been grappling with for centuries, and still nobody has settled it one way or the other, but the techniques are available to think that we're within a whisker of, like Goldbart's conjecture or something like that.
I think his argument was really that the settlement would mean that it would include both arguments for and arguments against. So that's the settlement. The settlement, that's why it's a metaphysical reality of our world, that there will always be arguments for and there will always be arguments against.
Yes, but as I remember the quotation, which I'm afraid is not very clearly, I wish I could reproduce it verbatim, but as I vaguely remember it, the implication was that we would have maybe not conclusive reason to come down one side or the other, but something like, a very, very compelling evidence. And of course, we can suppose that in particular what he thought was that we would have very compelling evidence to think that God did exist.
Yes.
So that's striking as well. I mean, it's almost as striking as this third quotation from Dawkins, although, of course, in Dummett's case, the claim is the claim of a believer rather than a non-believer. But as regards your main question, do I think of theism as a metaphysical issue or not? I'm afraid that I'm going to do that awful thing that philosophers always do, which is, depends what you mean by metaphysics. Well, as it happens, I have views about that, and I've written something about that. But
claims in this sector will always show or demonstrate a positive and a negative. That's a reality of this type of claim. Yeah. That there will always be a positive claim and a negative claim being made in relation to it.
Yes. So, I mean, eventually, if we pursued what you just said, eventually the issue, well, perhaps eventually is not the right word, perhaps quite quickly, the issue would be what work positive and negative are doing in this context, and in particular whether they're doing whether they've somehow taken over the role of the terms true and false, or whether there's a kind of positivity and negativity that's rather different from truth and falsehood. I mean, all of those issues would surface quite quickly. Yes, I mean, that's a very cheap response for me to give, and a very annoying response for me to give. But actually, it is my response. I mean, it does depend on what you mean by metaphysics. And the word metaphysics is extremely fluid, gets used in all sorts of ways. There is a way of understanding metaphysics, which in particular is my own preferred way of understanding it, a rather loose understanding of the word metaphysics, whereby the answer to your question is yes, this does count as metaphysical. I mean, I like to operate with a particularly broad conception of metaphysics, but actually, and rather misleadingly, that isn't in fact the kind of usage that I had in mind earlier, both in the original presentation and in the exchange that I had with Andrew, when what was at stake was whether the claim that God exists counts as a metaphysical hypothesis. That was metaphysical being understood in a rather narrower sense. But I didn't do that thing that philosophers should do of defining my terms, so I apologise for that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your questions. I'm aware that we didn't get through everyone who raised their hand to begin with. However, we have come to the end of our allotted time. We're really grateful to everyone for coming here tonight. Of course, this is only the second episode in a six-part series. We haven't quite finished arrangements for next term, and in fact, the next event will be announced shortly. We already know that the next but one instalment will be Philip Goff speaking on the subject, Did the Universe Create Itself? I don't want to give a hint as to the answer, but I think it might turn out to be positive. However, please do come along to those and look at the website humanephilosophy.com or the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religions website for announcements. Do please stay here for another glass of wine and a chat before you head off tonight. But before you do any of that, please thank once again Professor Adrian Moore for such an interesting and enjoyable talk.